The Galactic United Military Academy sat in orbit above a blue gas giant that no one had ever bothered to name. It was a massive station, shaped like a wide wheel, with 5 long spokes reaching out from its center. It turned slowly in the dark, and from the outside, it looked calm and quiet. From the inside, it was never either of those things. More than 4,000 cadets lived and trained aboard the station at any given time. They came from over 40 different species. Some were tall enough to brush the ceiling in standard hallways. Some were small enough to sit comfortably on a human's palm. Some breathed methane and moved through sealed environmental suits. Some had 4 arms, or 6, or none at all. Some had no eyes and used pulses of sound to map the world around them. The academy had been built to hold every kind of life that had found its way to the stars, and over the course of 200 years, it had done exactly that. The hallways were wide. The ceilings were high. Directional signs were printed in 12 languages and updated automatically, depending on who was walking past. The cafeteria had 17 separate food zones, each built around a different atmosphere and a different set of dietary needs. The training halls were enormous, with adjustable gravity floors and interchangeable surface panels that could simulate almost any terrain in the known galaxy. The Galactic United Military Academy, or GUMA, as almost everyone called it, was the best military school in existence. Getting in was difficult. Staying in was harder. Humans had only been allowed to apply for 80 years. Before that, the Galactic Coalition had not been entirely sure what to do with them. Humans were small by most standards, short-lived, and had spent the better part of their recorded history in conflict with each other. They had no natural armor plating, no venom, no enhanced senses. They could not survive in vacuum without a suit. They could not handle extreme cold or radiation without equipment. On paper, they did not look like much, but they kept showing up anyway. That was the thing about humans that the Coalition had not fully accounted for. They kept showing up, kept applying, kept pushing at doors until the doors opened. So the Coalition let them in, mostly because saying no required more effort than saying yes, and because humans had a tendency to find their way in regardless. At GUMA, human cadets were still a small group. In any given year, there were no more than 30 or 40 of them, spread across the different training tracks. Most alien cadets were polite to them. A few were genuinely warm. Almost none took them seriously as soldiers, and even fewer thought to ask why. Cadet Jake Mercer was 22 years old. He came from a small town in Ohio and had been at GUMA for just under 2 years. He was not the tallest human at the academy, not the loudest, not the fastest. He had short brown hair and a calm, even face, and the habit of going very quiet in situations where other people tended to fill the silence with noise. His instructors noted in his file that he was steady, focused, and difficult to read. His bunkmate had a different word for it. That bunkmate was Cadet Cole Havley from New Mexico. Cole was loud, fast-talking, and always moving. He had the kind of energy that made rooms feel smaller and conversations feel faster. He was smart in a scattered, sideways way that did not always show up cleanly on written exams, but showed up very clearly whenever something needed to be figured out quickly and without much equipment. He and Jake had been assigned to the same bunk block in their first week at the academy, and had gotten along immediately, the way 2 people sometimes do when they balance each other out without meaning to. The third human in their weapons theory class was Cadet Nora Callahan from Portland, Oregon. Nora was organized, sharp, and had the particular kind of calm that comes from growing up as the oldest of 5 children. She was better at the academic side of GUMA than either Jake or Cole, and she had a talent for knowing exactly when to speak and when to wait. She did not have Cole's noise or Jake's stillness. She was somewhere in the middle, steady in her own way, and the other 2 had come to trust her read on situations without ever sitting down to discuss it. Their class was called Weapons of Significance, a cross-species combat heritage survey. Every cadet in the room called it Historic Blades, because it was shorter and more honest. The class met twice a week, third ring of the station. The seats faced a raised presentation platform at the front of the room, and the air in the hall had a faint smell that Jake had never been able to fully place. Something like mineral oil and cold stone together. The instructor was Commander Vorath. He was Korvath, which meant he was large, broad, and covered in the dense layered skin that gave his species a look somewhere between stone and bark. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried weight of someone who had never needed to be fast, because nothing in his experience had made speed necessary. He had served in 4 military campaigns before coming to Guma. He had 17 commendations on his record. He had been teaching the Historic Blades class for 11 years, and had run it the same way every single time, with total seriousness, no shortcuts, and the quiet expectation that every cadet in the room would bring the same level of respect to the subject that he brought himself. Vorath had never had a human cadet finish above a C average in his course. He did not say this with any cruelty. It was simply a thing he had observed and accepted, the same way he accepted that certain cadets struggled in zero-gravity drills or high-pressure environments. It was, in his view, a matter of cultural depth. Ancient weapons were not just objects. They were records of history, of sacrifice, of entire civilizations pressed into metal and stone. Understanding them required a connection that he had not yet seen in a human student. Jake was aware of this attitude. Most human cadets were. It was something more frustrating than hostile. It was patient and gentle, the kind of underestimation that held the door open while assuming you could not open it yourself. He did not argue with it. He just came to class, did the reading, and kept most of his thoughts where they usually lived, which was somewhere behind his eyes and well away from other people. On the morning of the semester's most anticipated lecture, Jake arrived at the hall early. Cole arrived exactly on time, eating a protein bar he absolutely was not supposed to have in a formal lecture room. Nora arrived 30 seconds behind Cole, noticed the protein bar immediately, and gave him a look that he acknowledged and then ignored. The hall filled in around them. Korvath cadets took their seats with the careful movements of large beings in a shared space. A group of Valesi cadets arranged themselves near the front row, all 6 arms folded, their wide, dark eyes already fixed on the presentation platform. A pair of Arai cadets settled near the back, their skin flickering with the soft bioluminescent pulse that meant they were relaxed. Vorath came in when the hour turned exactly. He was carrying a long black case sealed with a pressure lock, and he set it down on the platform table with a slowness and care that made the whole room go silent without anyone deciding to. It was the kind of careful that told you, without any words, that what was inside the case was something that mattered. Jake looked at the case. He looked at Vorath's expression. He leaned back in his chair and waited. Something about this lecture, he could already feel, was not going to go the way anyone expected. Vorath did not open the case right away. He stood behind the presentation table and looked at the room first. His crest fins, the wide bony ridges that ran along the top of his head and down the back of his neck, were fully raised. For a Korvath that meant focused attention, the same way a human might straighten up and square their shoulders before saying something important. The cadets who knew Korvath body language read it immediately and got a little more still in their seats. The ones who did not know it well enough picked up on the mood in the room anyway and followed along. Vorath spoke in Standard Galactic, which was the common language used at Guma, and translated in real time through the small receivers every cadet wore, clipped to one ear. He said that what he was about to show them was not a lesson in history alone. He said it was a lesson in what history feels like when it has been made into something you can hold. He said, that weapons from the old ages of any civilization are not simply tools. They are proof. Proof that a species survived long enough, cared deeply enough, and suffered enough to make something that would last beyond the people who made it. He paused. The room waited. Then he opened the case. It unfolded in two halves like a book, revealing a long interior lined with dark material. 7 blades sat inside it, each one held in place in its own shaped bracket. Each blade was behind a thin, faintly glowing energy barrier that hummed so quietly you could only hear it if the room was completely silent, which it now was. ThSci-Fi lifted each blade's information panel as he introduced them one by one. The first was the Sunfang of the Valesi Third Age. It was a curved blade, almost fluid in its shape, with an edge that caught the light and held it for half a second longer than it should have. The Valesi cadets in the front row leaned forward as one. The blade had been used in what the Valesi called a war of declaration, a formalized conflict, centuries old, where 2 ruling houses had settled a territorial dispute through a series of single combats. The warrior who had carried the Sunfang had fought 11 duels in 9 days, without a loss. The blade had passed through 12 generations of the same family before being donated to the Coalition War Museum. The second was the stone tooth of Korvath General Makdur. It was a broadsword, broad and heavy, made from volcanic glass that had been shaped and treated over months until it held an edge sharper than most refined metals. It was not elegant. It was not meant to be. It looked like something built to end arguments permanently. Makdur had carried it through a campaign on the Korvath southern continent over 300 years ago, a campaign that lasted 8 months and saw the general in direct combat 47 times. He had survived all 47. The third was the silver needle of RI Admiral Sivith. It was thin, barely wider than a finger at its widest point, and it tapered to a tip so fine that it was almost invisible from the side. The RI were a species that navigated by light and sound, and their combat history reflected this. The silver needle had been designed for precise, fast thrusts at exact anatomical points. In the right hands, it needed almost no force at all. Siveth had used it during the RI border wars and had become something close to a legend among her people. The 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th blades came from 4 other species: the dense spiral sword of the Dreshkai, the hollow-spined lance blade of the Murith, a short, wide cutting tool from the ancient Teravai that did not translate well into any common language category, and a long, single-edged ceremonial warblade from the Sonveth people that had been carried by their last high commander before the species had abandoned ground warfare entirely. ThSci-Fi spoke about each one slowly and with care. He described the civilizations that had made them, the conflicts they had come from, the individuals who had carried them. He described what it meant within each culture for a blade to be passed down, preserved, displayed. For the Korvath, a weapon kept for generations was a promise that the fight had been worth having. For the Valesi, it was an acknowledgement that the past was still watching. For the Arai, a preserved blade was a kind of record, as precise and permanent as any written document. The alien cadets listened with the kind of attention that comes not from being told to pay attention, but from actually caring. The Valesi cadet, who had leaned forward when the Sunfang came out, kept her secondary hands pressed flat against the desk. One of the Korvath cadets near the middle of the room had his head bowed slightly. It was not sleep. It was something closer to a gesture of respect, the kind given not to a person in the room, but to something much older. Cole had finished the protein bar and tucked the wrapper into his sleeve. He was watching ThSci-Fi with the expression he used when he was trying to look more engaged than he was. Nora was taking notes on a small tablet. Careful notes, the kind she always took. Organized, precise, with small additional observations added in the margins. Jake was not taking notes. Jake was looking at the blades. He had been looking at them since the case opened, and he had not really stopped. His eyes moved from one to the next with the slow, methodical focus of someone doing mental work that was not connected to anything the instructor had said. He was not reading the information panels. He was not watching Vorath's hands as he pointed. He was looking at the blades themselves, at the shapes, the angles, the weight distribution you could estimate just from proportion, the way the grips were built, the place on each blade where the design choices started to tell you something about who had made them and why. Nora glanced at him once. His face was the same as it always was, calm, focused, slightly far away. She looked back at her notes. Vorath had reached the stone tooth now. He was speaking about MacDoor's campaign in detail, about the conditions on the southern continent during that period, about the particular kind of warfare that had made a heavy volcanic glass broadsword the right choice for a general who fought in rocky, open terrain against enemies in thick armor. Jake tilted his head slightly to the left, then slightly to the right. His eyes settled on the place where the blade's grip met its guard, and then moved along the length toward the tip, and then came back. Cole noticed. He looked at Jake, then at the blade, then back at Jake. He leaned over an inch and kept his voice low. "You good?" he said. Jake did not answer right away. Then he said, quietly, "The weight's wrong." Cole looked at the blade again, then at Jake. "The weight is wrong," he repeated, very slowly as though making sure he had heard it correctly. He said nothing else. Cole straightened up, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and decided to say nothing. He had known Jake long enough to understand that when Jake said something like that, in that particular tone, there was usually more behind it than it seemed, and that the best thing to do was wait. Vorath announced that the energy barriers on the display case would now be lowered, one at a time, so the cadets could approach and observe each blade from close range. He reminded the class that close range meant a respectful distance of no less than half an arm's length. The blades were replicas, he said, but they were molecularly identical to the originals, and were to be treated as such. The barriers came down one by one with a soft sound like a breath being let out. The cadets began to move toward the display. The alien cadets moved along the display table the way people move through a place they consider sacred. Slowly, carefully, with a particular kind of quiet that was not the quiet of boredom, but of something much closer to reverence. The Valesi cadets at the front were the first to reach the Sunfang. One of them pressed two of her secondary hands flat against her chest, just below her collarbone, and held them there for several seconds. It was a gesture that in Valesi culture meant something close to, "I see you, and I am glad you survived." She did not say anything. She did not need to. The Korvath cadets moved together as a small group, reaching the stone tooth at roughly the same time. They stood around it in a loose half-circle, and one of them, a tall cadet named Vardun, who rarely spoke in class, made a low sound deep in his chest. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound made at the end of a story that turned out the way it should have. The Ori cadets drifted past several of the blades before stopping at the Silver Needle. They stood close, their skin shifting through soft colors, and looked at it the way someone might look at a photograph of a person they never met, but had always admired. Nora moved along the row at a steady pace, pausing at each blade for a reasonable amount of time, reading the information panels carefully, adding things to her notes. She was respectful and organized, and approached the whole thing the way she approached most things, with the goal of understanding it properly. Cole drifted along behind her, hands in his pockets, looking at each blade with the expression of someone who was genuinely trying to feel what everyone else seemed to be feeling, and not quite getting there. He was not being disrespectful. He just had no framework for it. He had no personal thread that connected him to any of them. And he was honest enough with himself to know it. Jake walked the row on his own. He moved at a different pace from everyone else. Not slower exactly, and not faster. It was more that his pace was disconnected from the mood of the room. Everyone else was moving like the occasion demanded. Jake was moving like someone who was looking for something specific, and had not found it yet. He passed the Sunfang without stopping long. He glanced at the silver needle and kept walking. He paused at the Dreshkai spiral sword for a moment, turned his head to one side, then moved on. He reached the stone tooth of Makdur and stopped. He stood there and looked at it. Vorath Say was on the far side of the room, answering a question from a Murath cadet about the hollow-spined lanceblade. Nora was 3 blades down, still writing. Cole was standing near the ThSci-Fi cutting tool, trying to figure out which end was the handle. Jake looked at the stone tooth for a long time. He looked at the grip first, then the guard, and the body of the blade. His eyes moved along its length the way a builder's eyes move along a wall, checking for things that are not immediately visible, but that show up if you know how to look. He looked at the point where the blade began to taper. He looked at where the edge had been reground at some point in the weapon's history, which you could see if you looked closely enough at the angle of the bevel. Then he reached out and picked it up. He did it with one hand. He did it without any ceremony, without pausing to think about it, with the easy, natural motion of someone picking up a hammer off a workbench to check its weight. His hand closed around the grip, he lifted it off the bracket, and he held it. The sound the room made was no sound at all. It went completely silent, in the specific way that only happens when multiple people all stop making noise at exactly the same moment. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of a held breath. Vorath Say turned around. His crest fins, which had been relaxed, snapped outward to their full width in a single motion. It was not a voluntary movement. It was a reflex, the Korvath physical response to shock. The Valesi cadet near the front made a small sound that was not quite a word. Vardoon, the Korvath cadet, went very still. Nora looked up from her tablet, saw what was happening, and closed her eyes for one brief moment. Cole stopped trying to figure out the ThSci-Fi tool. He looked at Jake. He looked at Vorath Say. He looked back at Jake. He did not move. Jake turned the blade over in his hand. He shifted his grip once, then again. He adjusted the angle of his wrist. He held the blade out in a loose guard position for 2 seconds, felt something, and brought it back in. He turned it over once more and ran his free hand lightly along the flat of the blade, from guard to tip, not touching the edge, just feeling the shape. Vorath Say opened his mouth to speak. Jake said in a completely even, conversational tone, the tone of someone pointing out that a drawer does not close right. "Why is this so poorly balanced?" Vorath Say closed his mouth. Jake was not being rude. That was the thing about it that made it so hard to respond to quickly. There was no challenge in his voice, no disrespect, no attempt to make a point in front of the room. He sounded exactly like someone who had just picked up a tool and noticed, with honest curiosity, that something about it was not quite right. He continued without waiting for an answer, mostly talking to himself in the quiet way he sometimes did when he was working through a problem. He said the weight distribution was sitting too far back toward the base of the blade, which was called the forte. That was fine for a blocking or catching weapon, but it made extended combat exhausting, because you had to do more work to bring the tip around on a strike. For a sword that was reportedly used in 47 engagements, the balance point was not where you would want it. He shifted his grip again and said that the handle taper was also slightly off. When you moved the blade laterally at speed, the pivot point shifted in a way the grip did not account for. Not badly, not enough to make the blade fail, but enough to feel wrong after a few hours. Then he turned the blade slightly in the light, and said that whoever had sharpened this blade last, and it had been resharpened at least twice, you could see the slight inconsistency in the bevel angle if you looked at it right, had not matched the original edge geometry. The angle was a few degrees shallower than the first grind. That had moved a small amount of mass away from the edge, which had shifted the balance even further back from where it was probably designed to sit. He said it quietly, clearly, without drama. He set the blade back on its bracket with the same casual care he had used to pick it up, at its housing, and looked up. The entire room was staring at him. ThSci-Fi had not moved. His crest fins were still fully extended. His expression was not one that Jake had seen on him before. It was not fury, exactly. It was something more complicated than either of those. Something that does not have a clean word in most languages. The expression of a person who has just had a belief they did not even know they were holding quietly fall apart under them. Nora had both hands flat on her tablet. She was not writing anything. Cole was looking at Jake with an expression that clearly said, "Buddy, I cannot tell if you just did something incredible or something catastrophic, and I am very interested to find out which." Jake looked around at the room. It took him a moment to fully register the weight of the silence. He said, in the same even voice, "Did I miss something?" Nobody answered him, not right away. The room stayed quiet for a few more seconds, and in those seconds, something had shifted in it. Though no one could have said clearly what, or in which direction it had shifted, or what it was going to mean. ThSci-Fi lowered his crest fins slowly. He looked at Jake Mercer with an expression that had gone from shock to something much harder to read. Then he turned back to the class and said in a measured voice that the observation period was over, and that everyone should return to their seats. Cadets moved. Chairs scraped. The room filled back in with noise. Jake walked back to his seat, sat down, and pulled out his notes like nothing had happened. By the end of class, word had already started moving through the station. Guma was large, but the kind of large where information still traveled fast. By the time Jake, Cole, and Nora walked out of the lecture hall, 3 cadets in the hallway were already talking about it in lowered voices. By the time they reached the cafeteria for the midday meal, a Korvath cadet from an upper year stopped near their table, looked at Jake directly, and then walked away without saying anything. It was not hostile. It was more like he was confirming something with his own eyes. Nora set her tray down and said, "So, that happened." Cole said, "That really happened." Jake was already reading something on his tablet, and said without looking up, "I put it back exactly where it was." Nora and Cole looked at each other. Cole said, "Jake, the thing is not about the putting back." He looked at both of them, and then at the table for a moment, and for the first time since the lecture hall, he seemed to actually consider the weight of what had taken place. Not from the outside, the way everyone else had been reading it, but from the inside, from his own position in the room when it had happened. He said, "I should not have touched it without asking." Nora said, "No, you should not have." He nodded once. He did not look particularly worried, but he did look like someone making a real note of something. Then he went back to his tablet. Cole said under his breath, "I genuinely cannot tell if he is the most confident person I have ever met, or if he just has no idea how rooms work." Nora said, "I think it might be both." ThSci-Fi did not contact Jake that afternoon. Jake went to his other classes, ran his scheduled maintenance hour in the equipment bay, ate dinner, and went to sleep without hearing anything from the instructor. Cole interpreted this as a good sign. Nora interpreted it as a delay, not a resolution. Nora was right. The next morning, a message came through Jake's Academy comm channel. It was brief, written in ThSci's formal style, which meant it used more words than it needed to, and every one of them was chosen carefully. It asked Cadet Mercer to remain after the following session for a private conversation. It was not marked as a disciplinary summons, which had its own specific format. It was something else, but the message did not say what. Jake showed the message to Cole, who read it twice, and said, Okay, you're probably not expelled. Jake said, I was not planning on being expelled. Cole said, No, of course not. Why would you plan on that? The following class session was a standard lecture day. No display items, no special case on the table. ThSci taught the class with his usual focus, and gave no indication of what had happened 2 days prior. Cadets watched him, and watched Jake, and got nothing from either of them. At the end of the hour, ThSci said simply that he needed a moment with Cadet Mercer, and the rest of the class filed out. Nora paused in the doorway. Jake nodded at her. She left. ThSci waited until the room was empty. Then he turned to Jake and was quiet for a moment. The Korvath way of opening a serious conversation, which was to let the silence establish that what came next mattered. He asked where Jake had learned to assess a blade in that manner. Jake considered the question and answered it honestly. He said his grandfather had been a bladesmith, not a professional, not a historical expert, a hobbyist, but a serious one. The man had run a small workshop behind his house and had spent 30 years making and repairing blades in his spare time. He had started teaching Jake when Jake was around 7, by the basic sharpening and handle work on his own. By the time he was 16, he had made 2 full blades from raw stock. He had kept doing it because he liked it. It was not a warrior tradition in his family. It was not sacred in any formal way. It was just something they did. ThSci was quiet for longer than usual after that. Then he said, and his voice was carefully flat, the way a voice gets when the person speaking is managing a reaction they have not finished processing. He said that Jake had identified 3 separate structural and maintenance issues in a blade that had been studied and documented by weapons historians for over 2 centuries, and had done so in under 3 minutes while standing in a class observation period. Jake said he had mostly been looking at it since the case opened. The assessment had taken a while. It just looked short from the outside because he had done the thinking before he said anything. ThSci was quiet again. He told Jake that no punishment was being recorded for the unauthorized handling of the display item. He said this without explaining why, and Jake did not ask. Then, he told Jake he would be in contact before the end of the week, and dismissed him. 2 days later, Jake was called to a different room entirely. It was a smaller study space on the 4th ring, reserved for faculty meetings and private instruction. When he arrived, ThSci was there, but so was someone Jake had not met before. She was Valesi, with the long fluid build and the 6 arms of her species, and she wore a slightly different insignia than the standard Guma faculty patch. She was Lieutenant Commander Praise, she told him, a weapons historian attached to Guma as a guest faculty member. She was part of the Coalition's Academic Preservation Division, and had been at the station for 4 months studying the cross-species curriculum. She told Jake, in a direct and organized way, that ThSci had briefed her on what had happened in the lecture hall. She said she was not there to question him or evaluate him. She wanted to know if he would be willing to sit with her for 2 hours and look at some material she had prepared. Jake said yes. Praise opened a large display panel on the wall. It showed high-resolution digital scans of dozens of historic human blades pulled from various museum archives and academic databases. A Japanese katana, a Chinese dao, a Viking-age longsword, a Roman gladius, a late medieval European arming sword, a 15th-century German messer, a Scottish claymore, more than 40 blades total, each one labeled with its origin, period, and region. She asked him to look at them and share what he noticed. Jake sat down and began. He was not fast. He looked at each blade the way he had looked at the stone tooth, carefully, moving through the shape from grip to tip, reading the design choices the way a person reads a sentence. Then he talked. He explained the katana's differential hardening process. The spine and the edge of the blade were treated separately during forging, which made the edge hard enough to hold a very fine cutting angle, while the spine stayed flexible enough not to shatter under impact. It was a solution to a real problem, he said, and it had taken Japanese smiths centuries of iteration to get it right. He talked about the Roman gladius. It was short by almost any standard, barely longer than a large knife. That was a deliberate choice, he explained, made for close quarters formation fighting, where a long blade was a disadvantage. A soldier in a Roman line did not have room to swing. He needed to push and thrust. The gladius was built for exactly that, and the shortness reduced arm fatigue over hours of sustained fighting, which mattered when you were in a line that might hold for most of a day. He talked about the evolution of the European longsword through the medieval period, how it changed as armor technology changed, how the design of the grip and crossguard shifted as smiths adapted to what they were fighting against. When plate armor made edge cuts less effective, swords got different. The tip geometry changed, the grip design changed, the use changed. Press did not speak much during this. She watched him and occasionally made a mark on her own notes. By the time Jake had worked through 15 or 20 blades, she had stopped writing entirely. She was just listening. Afterward, she sat back and was quiet for a moment. Then she said that what struck her was not the depth of the knowledge, though the depth was significant. What struck her was the nature of it. She had studied weapons cultures across 14 species. Every other culture she had studied, including her own, had at some point in its history reached a moment of cultural crystallization with its ancient weapons, a point where the design was considered complete, perfect, finished, and was preserved rather than continued. Humans, as far as she could tell from everything Jake had just described, had never fully reached that point. They had kept asking why. They had kept changing things. They had kept making the blade better, or trying to, right up until the moment that blades stopped being relevant to warfare at all. She looked at Jake and said that in her professional opinion, the human approach to tools was one of the most unusual things she had encountered in 20 years of comparative weapons history. Jake said he thought most people just liked to figure out how things worked. Price said quietly that this was perhaps exactly the point. Outside the room, in the hallway, Cole Hadley was waiting. When Jake came out, Cole asked what had happened in there. Jake said they had looked at some old blades and talked about balance points. Cole stared at him. Then he said, "You have a gift for making things sound very small." Jake said, "It was a good conversation." Cole shook his head and started walking. "I broke a ceremonial spear yesterday," he said. "They've got me on maintenance duty for 2 weeks." Jake looked at him. Cole said, "I sat on it. Do not ask." The last session of the semester, for historic blades, was scheduled on a Tuesday morning, 3rd period, the same as every other session had been. Most cadets came in expecting a review lecture, the kind where the instructor summarizes what the class covered, gives a brief on what to expect in the final assessment, and fills the remaining time with questions. It was the standard format for an end-of-semester class at GUMA, and almost every instructor followed it without variation. ThSci-Fi did not follow it. When the cadets filed in and settled into their seats, they found the presentation table arranged differently from usual. The long black case was on it again, sealed, sitting in the center of the table. The rest of the table was clear. There were no notes laid out, no display panels activated, no assessment summary printed on the room's main screen. ThSci-Fi stood behind the table with his crest fins fully raised, the position he used when he was about to say something he considered important. The room got quiet faster than usual. ThSci-Fi looked at the class for a moment. Then he said that before the review portion of the session, he was going to do something he had not done in 11 years of teaching this course. He was going to change the format of the final lecture. He looked across the room to the back row and said Cadet Mercer's name. Jake looked up. Voratsay told him to come to the front of the room. The room did not make a sound. Jake pushed back his chair and walked to the front. He stood beside the presentation table. He did not look nervous, but he did look like someone who was paying close attention to where all the exits were. Voratsay opened the case. The stone tooth of Makdur sat in its bracket, the same as it had weeks ago. Voratsay stepped back from the table slightly, the smallest gesture of ceding the space in front of it, and told Jake to explain what he had observed about this blade, fully, to the class. Jake looked at the blade for a moment. Then he looked at the rune. Then he looked at Voratsay, who gave him nothing. No expression, no encouragement, no warning. Just the flat expectation that Voratsay gave everyone. Jake turned back to the class and started talking. He did not perform it. He was not dramatic about it, and he was not falsely casual about it either. He spoke the way he usually spoke, which was directly and without extra decoration. He described the stone tooth the same way he had described it in the observation period weeks ago, but this time he went slower, and he explained each thing rather than just naming it. He talked about the balance point and why it mattered. He said that for most blades, the balance point, the spot where the weapon sits level across one finger, was a deliberate design choice, and it told you something about how the blade was meant to be used. A blade balanced closer to the grip is easier to hold for long periods and works well for fast, repeated strikes. A blade balanced further toward the tip carries more impact force, but tires the arm faster. The stone tooth was balanced toward the grip, but not as far as it should have been for a heavy broadsword intended for sustained close combat. Someone had compromised the design somewhere. He talked about the resharpening. He picked the blade up this time, but he asked Voratsay first with a short look, and Voratsay gave him a brief nod. He held it toward the light and showed the class where the bevel angle changed along the edge. Almost invisible, unless you knew what you were looking for, but there, once you saw it. Someone had resharpened the blade in the field, without the tools to match the original angle. It was a small thing in isolation, but it had moved mass from one part of the blade to another, which had pushed the balance further back, which made the off-balance feeling worse than it had originally been. He set the blade down. Then he said something that had not been part of the original observation. He said that none of this made the blade a bad weapon. Makdur had used it in 47 engagements and had survived every one. The general had been a skilled enough fighter to compensate for the imbalance, probably without even thinking about it. The resharpening had been done in the field, which meant the campaign was still going, and someone needed a working edge, more than a perfect geometry. Those were real decisions, made under real conditions. The blade was not a failed object. It was an object that had been used hard, maintained under difficult circumstances, and had still done what it needed to do. He paused. He said the imbalance did not mean the warrior who carried it was anything less than what history said he was. It just meant the blade was a tool, and tools get used, and used things show their history. The room was quiet. Not the stunned quiet from weeks ago. This was different. This was the quiet of people who had just heard something land in a way they had not expected, and were sitting with it. The Valesi cadet near the front was looking at Jake with an expression that had moved a long way from the one she had worn the day he first touched the blade. Var Soon, the Korvath cadet who almost never changed his expression during class, was watching Jake with something that looked, if you were reading it right, like careful respect. Nora, back in her seat, had her tablet flat on the desk, and was not writing anything. She was just watching. Cole was sitting up straight for the first time all semester. Voratsay waited until it was clear that Jake was finished. Then he told Jake to return to his seat, and Jake did. ThSci stood at the front of the room for a moment. Then he spoke. He said that he had been teaching this course for 11 years, and had believed, without seriously questioning it, that understanding ancient weapons required a particular kind of cultural depth. The kind that came from direct lineage, from being part of a tradition that carried those weapons forward, that remembered them, that treated them as something more than machinery. He said he still believed that reverence had value, that knowing where a thing came from and who had bled for it mattered, that context was not decoration, it was part of the object. But he said, and he said it slowly, and with the careful weight of someone revising something they had held for a long time, that he had made an error. He had confused reverence with understanding. He had assumed that because humans did not approach ancient weapons with ceremony, they did not understand them deeply. What he had not considered was that there was another way to know a thing, not through lineage and ritual, but through use, through the willingness to pick something up, find the flaw in it, and ask why. He said that the most dangerous assumption a soldier could make was that those two things, reverence and understanding, were the same. They were not. And a warrior who only had one of them was missing something. He did not apologize. It was not a Korvath thing to do, but the weight of what he had just said was clear to everyone in the room, and everyone in the room understood what it cost him to say it. He moved on to the review portion of the lecture. After class, in the hallway, Nora fell into step beside Jake and was quiet for a moment. Then she said he had done well. Jake said he just said what he saw. Nora said that was usually the hardest part, and Jake thought about that, and nodded. A few days later, a short message arrived in Jake's Academy comm channel from ThSci. It asked whether Cadet Mercer would be willing to serve as a student instructor's assistant for the weapons theory course in the following semester. The role involved helping to prepare materials, assisting with blade assessments, and occasionally speaking to the class when ThSci judged the input useful. Jake read the message twice. Then he wrote back and said, yes. He showed the message to Nora. Nora read it and said, that is a significant thing. Do you understand that it is a significant thing? Jake said, it is a good class. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, yes, it is. Cole appeared from around the corner in a maintenance uniform. He had one more day of his 2-week penalty for the spear incident, and he looked like someone who had thought deeply about the choices that had led to the current situation, and had not yet decided whether he would make different ones. He looked at Jake and said, good news? Jake said, ThSci wants me to help teach next semester. Cole stared. Then he grinned the wide, crooked grin that meant he was genuinely pleased about something. He pointed at Jake and said, okay, that is something. Jake said, it's just a teaching assistant role. Cole said, Jake, 3 weeks ago you picked up a sacred alien war relic and told the whole room it was badly made. And now the guy who owns it wants you to help him teach the class. Jake considered this. Cole said, the galaxy has no idea what it got into when they let us in. After a moment he said, probably not. The station turned slowly in the dark above the unnamed blue gas giant. Same as always. Somewhere in the fourth ring, a long black case sat on a table in a locked faculty room. Inside it, the stone tooth of General Makdur rested in its bracket, solid and old and slightly out of balance, in exactly the way that everything real and used and worth keeping tends to be.